Hello and welcome to my Physics 180 lab presentation on engineering drawbridges. You might be wondering, how did I come up with such a topic? This was a question on, I think, test 3 that kind of threw me for a loop, because it asks, would it be easier to raise the drawbridge if the angle were larger or smaller? And I mean, to begin with, we have some dimensional issues going on here with this being 6 meters and this 30 degrees, but basically from this question, if I'm, the guys in the castle that are actually having to pull this thing up with a rope, what I really want to know is how much force is applied and how much work is required, and how can we make it easier and make this thing better? And then for some historical context, I wanted to kind of explore the other types of drawbridges and stuff that existed. So I set up an experiment where I basically did that. The vernier cart here will measure the force as I pull the drawbridge up, and I can use the protractor to measure the angle, and then we can take the integral of that to give me the work over time, or sorry, just the work over the displacement that we're measuring here, and try to figure out how to make this easier. So here you can see a video. Oh, well, this one is just to show that as you lift it, the angle is increasing. So that'll mean that our force required will change because the sine of theta will approach 1, and then our torque is r times force times sine theta. Sine of 90 is 1, so the closer it gets to the top, I'm thinking that it should get. And here's the video of it, just the experiment just happening. I did kind of mess up on measuring how high to make this, so at the end it kind of does this little like bouncy thing because there's a small discrepancy between the height of the pulley and the height of my drawbridge. So you'll see that reflected in the graph as well, and I kind of like kept that out of the calculations part. And it pretty much did look as expected. We start off with, let's see, what do we got? About 1.2 newtons to get it like right off the ground, but by the time that we get it closed, we're only seeing 0.165. So it got a lot easier over the course of its swing. And right here, the string bouncing on this part of the graph that I kind of left out. But yeah, basically this is just kind of what I wanted to see, like how much force are we actually using to pull this up? Does it get easier as it goes up? And then for historical context on drawbridges, the ones that I'm talking about here are ones that were made on castles between like the year 1000 and the year 1400, because this is when they started building castles, and the designs kept getting more advanced over time as well. So, for example, people kept tunneling underneath the castles to try to invade, so they came up with more creative ways to prevent that from happening. And one of those ways was to put a big moat around it. So they started building castles like way up on the top of the hill, or like out in the middle of a lake, or just digging giant moats around it. And with a giant moat, you're going to need a way to get across that to get into your castle. So drawbridges also became really popular. And these things were built by guys called master masons or castle builders, who were basically the closest thing probably to civil engineers of that time. They already had, basic technology like pulleys and wheels and like that kind of thing. And but what I really want to look at is how they kind of advanced from the basic one that we saw in the example problem to things that were more amenable to the guys actually operating them. So this picture kind of does a pretty good job explaining it. You get your guys on the winch up top. Here's a reconstructed of that style of winch. And surprisingly, they didn't really move away from this ever, at least based on my research. They did do things like add counterweights, or make like the arms and stuff longer on it, but it was still just two guys, manually operated, lifting this thing. And the two major improvements that I wanted to talk about and that I did experiments for are this like lever arm style drawbridge and the portcullis. These were kind of the two important ones. So this lever arm style, I mean, they didn't call it that, but that's basically what it is, because here's your lever arm sitting on your pivot point. You have a counterweight strapped to one side and nothing on the other side. So you could either do this two ways. You could make this counterweight, not heavy enough to lift it on its own, where it would just help the guys pulling it so that it was easier to pull up, or you could make it excessively heavy so that as soon as you let it go, it would just slam down and open. And the second one was really popular because the benefit there is that, well, the time that you're raising the drawbridge and closing the door is when you're probably under siege and you don't want somebody to get in. So being able to close it within a moment's notice is really helpful. And then this pit was also kind of a bonus tactical advantage here because any guys that made it through here that were attacking your castle would fall into the pit, and then you could like dump boiling oil on them or whatever you wanted to do because they were stuck down there. As for how they pulled it back up, surely there was like another chain connected to this winch or something, but honestly, that's kind of a later problem for like when you're not under siege. So clearly they already knew about levers. It was actually in the 200s BC, like way before this time, that Archimedes was already doing his work on the levers and mass balance, centers of mass, torques and equilibrium, kind of similar to what we did in the lab in class. And he basically said if this mass and this mass are the same, and they're the same distance from the fulcrum, then it will stay balanced. If they're not, and you have it heavier on one side, that it's going to move. But the interesting thing about the Middle Ages was they didn't know about Archimedes' work, and they actually didn't know about a lot of the stuff that we know about because it hadn't been copied over yet. I guess the monks just hadn't gotten around to it yet. So they kind of went through this period where they lost some of that information, but they still knew it through other sources because this was around the same time that universities started coming up. So like Italy, England, and France all had like really renowned universities where scholars were now going to school and doing these exact kind of studies and experiments and things. And we don't know much about this guy Numerarius, but his writings basically show that he was able to kind of come to his own discovery on a lot of the same work that Archimedes did with the same experiments with levers and things. So this principle, at the very least, was very well known at the time. So I decided to try to set up an experiment to see if I could size a counterweight to my own drawbridge setup from the previous one. So I got my mass of the bridge, length of the bridge. Here's my full body diagram down here. We want to make the torques here equal, so the torque from just from the drawbridge versus the torque from the mass that's going to be exerted on it from the mass like falling over the pulley. For a state of equilibrium, we would want those to be equal, so we can set those equal to each other, and I ended up calculating that it would be about 117 grams. When I tried that actually wasn't enough, so I kept stacking weights onto the little hanger physically until I found that like equilibrium point through experimentation, and that turned out to be more like 164 grams. So it's not like crazy far off, but I will point out that my calculations are based on like ideal pulley, ideal string, and my hinge here is made out of masking tape on the desk, so maybe we just deduce that masking tape doesn't make a great massless frictionless hinge. But to show the idea anyway, I retried the same experiment but with a 50-gram counterweight, just to show that it is actually a little bit easier with that opposing torque in the opposite direction. So this top one is the same test as the first experiment, just for reference, and this bottom one is with the 50 grams counterweight. So over the same displacement for the original one, we had 0.185. Now we've got 0.117, so that went down quite a bit. I'm ignoring this first like spike here because I think that had something to do with some amount of friction, maybe like in that masking tape hinge that was overcome or something going on here, but it doesn't seem very helpful to look at, so I'm not including that. But Without that, the maximum force that was required in this case was 0.85, as opposed to our earlier 0.11, just to get it off the ground. So the counterweights were helpful. So I did want to set up a third experiment just to do the portcullises because I thought they were really cool. So I basically put an oversized counterweight, this one's 200 grams, like way more than needed, just to demonstrate that all I have to do is let go of this and it'll just close immediately, super easy, no force required. And this was kind of the pinnacle of their drawbridge design because what do we need? We need it to be able to close easily and quickly in the case of like an attack. But one thing I will point out in this video of my drawbridge racing is that if you notice the string jumps around a lot at the end, so that's kind of going to be a challenge when you have this giant heavy like iron grate falling down and riding on chains, because how many times can you just let it slam into the ground like that before your chains are going to break? And that would be the worst case scenario when you're under attack, because all of a sudden your drawbridge is back open and they're just ready to come in. I mean, the portcullis would probably still be down, but... And then these holes that go through it, these are also a tactical advantage because they can shoot arrows through them at the enemy from the other side. But to reduce the stress on that chain, I mean, nowadays we would suggest something like a damper or like maybe a flywheel, but I did want to point out these spikes on the bottom of it. I mean, for one, if somebody gets stuck under there, well, they'll get impaled, which is awesome. But for two, the shape of these, if you're dropping this into like sand or clay or something, then they would kind of slow it down as it hit the ground, and it would, you know, kind of reduce the impulse and a lot of the stress on that chain. So for my overall results, I was able to kind of look at the relationship between the angle and the force and the torque and the work done and prove that it'll be a lot easier the more counterweights that we add. I tried to size an optimal counterweight for my custom drawbridge, but was unable to because I considered everything an ideal hinge, ideal pulley with no frictional forces, but in reality, there was some other stuff going on, probably small friction in the cart, small mass in the pulley, and of course my hinge made of masking tape. But overall, it worked out pretty well because I got a better understanding of how the force changes over time when we're dealing with like torques and angles approaching 90 degrees. So then lastly, I just wanted to point out that some of our drawbridge concepts have modern applications as well. For example, bascule bridges. This one is Dearborn Street Bridge in Chicago. And if you look at kind of what's going on with this like fatter part of it down at the bottom that kind of goes around like the pivot point, these are counterweights that go around the back of it. I mean, like on a really short lever arm, but they're probably also a lot heavier than anything that people in medieval times were using. And it's the same principle with just the lever arm counterweighted drawbridge. You have all this weight in the back, and these are probably actually sized correctly too to make it like really optimal, so you barely have to put any force on this at all to lift it up. So that makes it really easy on the motor to get it going. And they're pretty reliable. This one's been around since 1963. Kind of a funny thing though is the predecessor to this bridge was literally a medieval drawbridge, like the style from the one in the physics problem in the beginning. I mean, I don't even see any pulleys or like a winch or anything set up on this, so, and I mean, this is just an artist reconstruction as well. They might have just left them out, but no counterweights, you know, no portcullis, no lift assist, nothing whatsoever. Literally just guys with ropes pulling it up. And the story here is that the people hated this bridge so much because it took so much work to raise it and lower it and so much time. And it got stuck for like 2 days straight, like partway open, and nobody could do anything about it. So they finally got city council to take a vote to tear it down. But the people hated it so much that instead of waiting on them to tear it down, they went out in the middle of the night as an angry mob and tore it down themselves. So I guess the moral of the story here is don't build a bridge that's outdated by 400 years before you're even building it. Because, yeah. So I think that brings us full circle. Thanks for watching.